Hi everyone, it's Marcy and Alicia here. Today's episode is a crossover episode with the Color Gap podcast. So we're here today with Shahzia Noorally, who's the co-host of the Color Gap, and we'll once again be recording in dual mediums. So this discussion can be found as an exclusion podcast episode, but also a video copy on our YouTube channel.
And as always, in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we acknowledge that this podcast is being recorded on the traditional territories and oral practices of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta and Region 3 Métis Nation. We acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on these lands, and to all who assist in their stewardship for generations to come.
So Shahzia Noorally is an HR professional based in Calgary, who's on a personal mission to change the HR industry, challenging the norms around how great culture should be built and infused to make high-performing, engaging, and authentically diverse workplaces. She's a proud introvert, me as well, personal branding nerd, and someone who really believes in the power of social media to elevate both conversations and results for people and businesses. She's a published writer, speaker, and blogger, and holds both a Bachelor of Management degree from the University of Lethbridge, as well as a Master's of Education degree from the University of British Columbia. When she's not working, you can find her co-building her side hustle, the Color Gap podcast, that explores the unique and often uncomfortable truths of being a woman of color in business, and either exploring dog parks with her rescue dog, Ollie, or eating her way through Calgary, or traveling and eating her way through other cities. You can follow all her adventures in life and work on Twitter at Shahzia Noorally, and we'll include these links in our reference section of the podcast. And you can also connect with her on LinkedIn.
So what kind of puppy do you have? We also have puppies.
Oh, nice. Yeah, he's a little 10-pounder Shih Tzu Pomeranian. That's what we think, but we're not 100% sure. And I should go for surgery tomorrow to get most of his teeth.
Oh, no.
So
Poor buddy.
My baby, so it's definitely
great
to watch that happen. So
yeah, sometimes when we record in my house, my dog is underfoot. And there was one time we brought Marcy's dog over and they played while we recorded.
He's very vocal when he hears anything in the hallway, and so he's currently hidden in my bedroom in his kennel.
Aww, that's cute. So to jump right into the interview, Alicia and I are, running this podcast, but we are also both white women and have a great deal of privilege from our own identities. And there's blind spots for both of us that we acknowledge and we recognize. And we advocate strongly for taking an intersectional approach to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI. But it's really easy to suffer to your blind spots and kind of get lost in whiteness. And it's important for us to continue working at this, to always be aware of this and become better allies to others. So, and both of us have had some pretty terrible experiences in male-dominated workplaces and sectors, but we realize also that women of color have had it much worse, and their stories often go untold. And your podcast explores this added dimension, specifically being a woman of color and the unique experiences in the workplace. So we'd love it if you could share some more about these experiences and some stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always say that, even as women of color, we also are very much baked in privilege as well. I mean, both myself and my co-host, Susie Coe, were both born and raised in Canada. We haven't had the additional stresses and experiences of our mothers and the things that they went through immigrating to Canada. We're both educated here. We don't have accents. We have all of these things that sort of help us almost assimilate a little bit easier. But that was kind of where the conversation and the dialogue started between Susie and I around starting the podcast, was the fact that we are always assimilating. We are always trying to make sure that we don't necessarily stand out too much for being different. And there was this opportunity to talk about these things from the perspective of our lived experience, because when we looked around in our HR teams that we've worked with throughout our careers, it has been quite regularly something that we've noticed, that we've just never seen representation at the top of anyone that ever really looks like us. And so we started talking about that more around, is it just us? Is it just experiences specific to both Susie and I? Is it experiences specific to even being within the HR industry, that we know HR is very female dominated, but is it just something that we've happened to experience, even though both of us have worked in a number of different organizations and industries within the HR capacity and still had the same level of experience? And we started looking at the experiences of our mothers and the women that we know in our work lives and our personal lives that have immigrated here, and the lack of sort of ability for them to see how much courage that actually took to do that, and how much they're told to sort of wipe away all of the things that make them different. So that was where the podcast really started, was let's start talking about these things from a perspective around sharing those stories from a lived experience lens, because we think that the storytelling is what allows people to connect in a much more meaningful way, because it is our belief that no matter what race, religion, background, anything you come from, everyone has a lot of very common similarities around shared values, the things that they're looking for in their lives, for their families, all of these things. And we wanted to start helping people to understand that that is all very common amongst, no matter who you are. As women, we're all sort of trying to navigate the world that isn't necessarily designed for us, but as women of color, there's an additional lens to that and a layer where you're trying to be noticed and seen, and you have things that make you really different around your name, perhaps an accent, perhaps even just the way you were raised to use your voice or not use your voice in different circumstances. And we wanted to start breaking those barriers around, let's talk about these things from the perspective of storytelling, infuse some data in there, just to really start to recognize that we're not crazy, that it's not just our own experiences, that this is actually quite common. And we saw a gap and we didn't see anything in terms of the conversations, especially in Alberta and in Calgary, where we're both from. We just haven't really seen those conversations happening. So that's where it all started. And we've tried to infuse as much storytelling as possible from other women as well, so that we can recognize that it's not just isolated to the two of us, that it's a very common thing around other women of color and what they're feeling as well.
This is really great, because I know with the Alberta Women's Science Network that I volunteer with, we do have quite an intersection of female scientists. And I hear what you're saying over and over again from our female volunteers, just their lack of existence, I guess. Like, it's that even what's going on in the conversation right now amongst Calgary, all across Alberta, in Innisfil right now, about how I don't see a problem with race. We don't have any racism. I don't see it. And the reason is what you just said, is that for so long, everyone has been trying to fit in or assimilate or to integrate. And I feel like we've been kind of stuck on this diversity discussion where, sure, there's lots of different people who look different, but they don't get to be themselves. So I love that you're looking at this through your podcast. And with that, I know some of the work that I do is about how spaces can be gendered. And I think they can also be culturally, like, there can be very like a whitewashed version of a space too, right? And so I wanted to know, with that in mind, I saw that you often talk about on your podcast how HR is the middle class white woman. So if HR were personified, it would be this white woman, and how typically HR doesn't meet the needs of women of color. So could you explain more about what you mean by that? Because I definitely think I agree, but I don't think I fully understand this, and I would love to know more.
It's been something that has been kind of niggling at me for a really long time in my experiences working in HR. And until I got into a leadership position, that was kind of the first time where I really started to recognize that, hey, I didn't actually ever have any role models that looked anything like me in my career. They were typically white men or white women that I, had as leaders, and that was the norm for a very, very long time in majority of my HR career. And the thing that we sort of wanted to call out a little bit is that HR is supposed to be that role model around what, great diversity looks like, what great collaboration, what great leadership, all of these things that we teach. Yet we do a terrible job of actually representing that in our lived practice and the things that we actually do. We preach it, but we don't actually live it. And I think you can look around at a number of different HR teams in Canada and probably the US. Maybe in other pockets of the world, it might look a little different. But in our experiences, it's that we talk the talk about all of these things, but we just don't walk the walk. And how can we be credible when we are touting diversity to the business that we support and consulting businesses about the benefits of having diverse perspectives of lived experience that doesn't look like your lived experience? We're asking leaders to think about widening their circle and their networks when they're looking at recruiting and hiring on their teams. Yet we ourselves are not diverse in any capacity. When you look at it from a gender lens, that is the case. When you look at it from intersectional lenses around color, and there's just so much there with respect to even Indigenous relations and the things that we want to do, but not actually representing the lived experience in the people that we have in positions of influence. I think that I've often seen white women in positions of leading diversity and inclusion efforts for organizations, straight white women, that don't have more than one layer to kind of look at the world from. And so what we often find is that organizations will stop at the gender lens when they look at diversity, and they think, oh, we've got a board or leadership team that is 50% women. We can pat ourselves on the back and we can, stop doing the work because we look great on paper. But even what's been going on across the world in the last, even specifically in the US in the last couple of weeks, it's really brought to light that that's not enough. And we need to keep organizations, HR teams, all of these subsets of the organization accountable to really walking the walk instead of just touting it from an academic perspective, but not actually living it. So that's where that came from, was we just can't be credible if we're not actually representing that in our own teams as an HR function.
Excellent. I really like that point. And I think it also translate over to kind of the gender equality and feminist movements more broadly, in that they traditionally exclude women of color or women of color's experiences. And you often see that when we talk about the wage gap, right? And we say, oh, women earn 87 cents for every $1 a man earns, but that's really only the white woman's stat. And women of color, the wage gap is more like 35%. So, and I feel like this has, been brought to light a little more over the past couple of years, but still not enough to make, real change in how the movement communicates and action. So I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on this, and how that inadvertently kind of this white women gender equality movement, how it can be more like allies and less focused on, the white woman's experience, which inadvertently kind of gaslights women of color. So yeah, what is your advice on that? And then do you have any ideas on how we can redesign or ensure that these kind of conversations and movements don't exclude?
Yeah, I think I'll focus on the allyship piece, because I think that that's been brought to light so much more in the past week or so with everything going on in the States. And I think we all have such a responsibility to recognize, of course, our own privilege and how we can start to look at our own worlds, kind of audit them in such a way that we recognize where our gaps are in terms of our knowledge, in terms of our actual connections and relationships with people that don't look anything like us. And that supports so much of the movement in a really meaningful way, because what it really boils down to is human to human connection, conversation. It is really about seeking to understand what someone's lived experience might look like that might be a little bit different than yours. And it's asking those questions around, what is it like to, raise a little Black boy, for instance, and be nervous and afraid every time he leaves the home to not be sure if he's going to be able to come back. Like, what does that feel like as a mother, even as someone in your family, to recognize that that's something you live with every single day, and understanding that there's an opportunity for us to seek to understand. We may not obviously ever be able to fully, walk ourselves in those shoes, but looking at things from a human to human perspective is so incredibly important. And I think that there's something around also recognizing that the people that influence your life, whether that's who you follow on social media, the books that you read, the podcasts that you listen to, really do a bit of an audit on some of that to recognize that if everyone in your Instagram feed is an idealized version of yourself or looks like you in some capacity, that you're not challenging the norm around the way that you're thinking. If everyone that you follow on Twitter is exactly the same rhetoric as you, they think the same way, they, lift up the perspectives that you have, you're never going to see the world from a different perspective. So I always challenge people to look at even just changing up the people that influence them in some capacity, even if it's not a direct relationship that they have. And there's so much out there. Like I'm very obsessed with YouTube. I follow a lot of primarily beauty bloggers and such because I just have a real fascination with that. And there's just so many content creators that you can start to follow that they do a lot of storytelling and blogs and things that provide you a bit of a slice of life into their world. And that is one really simple way to start making yourself sort of understand a little bit more about what it is that they're really going through every single day. And adding that to your lens on social media, thinking about the books that you're reading, the books that you're reading to your kids, what are you really saying to them about how you're actually living, your truth, and you're preaching or practicing what you preach. That's so important because I think for a lot of us as women of color, we don't have very specific, almost mantras that are specific to us. We have the lean in mantra and things that are really specific to a place of privilege and access that doesn't necessarily look the same for us when the world isn't designed the same way. And so by expanding that circle of influence and looking at influencers and content creators, authors and podcasters and all of these different folks that put the stuff out there, it allows you to just expand your worldview a little bit more and get a flavor for how it's really, really different. And I think that in itself is just such an easy way to start shifting the dialogue. And then all of a sudden you're going to be a lot more critical in conversations about asking those questions about experiences that are not specific to your own. And I think that's one really great way to move the needle a little bit around the whole feminist movement, because it is about all of us in this together, but recognizing that our paths look a little bit different.
So I don't think that everyone, even within the feminist movement, still understands the concept of intersectional feminism. And to understand what Kimberly Crimshaw was really trying to get at right from the beginning was to show that specifically women of color, how they have an intersection of oppression or difficulties. And if you think of someone of color working in, say, the Alberta workforce, they will have potentially may be working in a misogynistic and sexist environment, which will affect all genders. But then also to have the extra layer of not coming, growing up in the whitewashed prairies, and having other lived experiences, that there are stereotypes that can be added on top of that, that you can experience, which is like a double-edged sword of things that you have to battle against within the workforce. And I know in our STEM community, women of color talk about this all the time, that they get hit double. They get hit because of their gender, and they get hit because of their cultural background or their racial background. And in the workplace, especially in Alberta, that's highly focused on the resource sector and potentially field work, for example. It's hard enough for women to get to go into the field to get the experience, let alone a woman of color. Like, I can't imagine being a STEM woman. In general, it's hard to walk into the lunch hall up in northern Alberta, let alone to walk in with a color of skin that's not usually seen there. So it can cause some extra layers of concern and frustration. And one of the solutions for this has been to create ERGs. So employee resource groups, if people don't know what an ERG is. And these groups, this is something that I've actually done a little of my research on, is understanding women's groups, ERGs. And the concept of them is to create a safer space to gather and maybe to network or to mentor each other, support each other. And this has been a positive for, I know, for example, many women in STEM, but I'm curious to understand from an intersectional point of view, And I do know some examples from the work I've done where this still ends up being not necessarily a safe space for women of color, whether they still feel they can't speak up, and or maybe they don't feel comfortable quite yet even being there. So I'm curious on your take on this, and how does a space like that affect women of color? And it having their own space helpful, or is it a hindrance? So what's your take on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on ERGs because in my last organization, I was part of the leadership team of our women's network. And how that actually came about was because when the women's network was launched, it was all white women that were in the leadership team. And there was not even a consideration around actually diversifying what that looked like. And I was really vocal at that organization because I had sort of just a sense of like recognizing that it was an open space for me to bring up some of these things. And so how I actually got on the leadership team was actually calling it out that this is not representative of this organization, of the women that work here, that it's such a miss that it wasn't even thought of around just bringing different lived experiences into that leadership team. And what we found as well is they went out and they actually did a whole recruitment process to ensure that they had representation of a woman of color on that team. And they ended up actually hiring two of us to sit on that committee. And it was great, but it was also so difficult for us to be really taken seriously in terms of the lens that we were bringing that was a little bit different. And what we've always found with respect to any of those types of movements is that it does require the people at the top and the leadership of the organization to really care and to recognize that there's something else there that you're not maybe seeing outside of just the gender lens and the things that people automatically kind of fall back on. And so for International Women's Day this past year, we actually did this call out to the organization to ask women across the company to submit their lived experiences, to talk to us about what really is going on, because we can talk about how we're a great employer, we can talk about how we have a very small pay gap, all of these things, but there's also the actual experience of what your day-to-day life is like. And we were so blown away by the submissions that we received that were really raw and vulnerable. And we specifically went out to seek out experiences from women that weren't necessarily in the majority. And what we did was we actually had someone do voiceovers of these, and we presented them to our executive team and shot a video to get their really raw reactions around what they were hearing. And it was the first time where that was really brought front and center to some of those folks, because these individuals were really privileged white men that didn't even recognize that this was a concern, that in their minds, we're a really diverse organization, but they never really looked at what are the layers in leadership? Where is the diversity actually stopping when it comes to moving from individual contributor to a leader level? And that was the first time that it actually kind of sunk in a little bit more, that some of these experiences were really, really, really different. But that's where it kind of ended, where it's like we had so much work to do to get them to start understanding that on a deeper level and how it was actually impacting bottom line around engagement, all of these things, because a lot of organizations will look at that sort of happiness factor of people around engagement. And it's not necessarily connected to productivity, to performance, to their sense of belonging, any of those pieces, right? And so they kind of check the box and move on and think, oh, we've got representation in the organization. We have 50% women in the leadership team, all of these things. And it's so much more difficult. And if we don't have representation at the top that even looks a little diverse, it's even harder. And from a resource group, especially because it's so much more grassroots, it requires so much tenacity, so much sort of perseverance to keep pushing and keep telling those stories and keep bringing it up, that you almost get burnt out a little bit too, because it becomes quite exhausting. It shows up in your everyday life. You can't escape it. It just kind of becomes this constant trying to convince people that it matters. And, by the time we had the International Women's Day experience, I left the organization just a couple of months ago to take on a new opportunity. So I don't know exactly where that landed, but it was just so evident that if we don't have that representation at the top in terms of leadership, all of that work is really wasted effort, because it can really stay at the surface and it's hard to get people to care.
Mm-hmm.
That, yeah, and that's interesting, because it shows you how just because you don't hear the lived experiences doesn't mean they're not happening, right? And um, it also shows how we often put the burden on those who have those intersectional experiences, whether it be um, women on top of racial tensions, on top of disability, LGBTQ. It ends up being those people, those exact people that have the lived experiences, that end up being the ones that have to do all the work, right? So it's so important, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about allyship in a minute, to have that kind of concept of understanding that it shouldn't just fall on those who are experiencing those life experiences to make the change. But it also shows how some of our strategies are not helpful. And we've talked about the lean in a little bit already today, and our listeners are going to know that I talk about this all the time, how much I hate that movement, but how it is very much designed on that whiteness, what you mentioned about the HR whiteness HR experience, and the assumption that you just have to lean in to be successful. If you're not successful, it's because you didn't lean in good enough or well enough or properly. And it shows you how so much of these systemic barriers are forgotten or not even considered when you're thinking about that. And it's very much a neoliberal feminist, white feminist movement. And I know that Sandberg herself has made comments since she wrote the book, but the problem is the book is written, and it's kind of like the Bible now of this discussion. So when you think about this methodology and this concept of how, and maybe it's worked for many white women, to the networking breakfasts, the events, all these types of things, and there has been lots of critics of this. I know the work I've done in the resource sector, Dr. Dean LaPlange will tell you that if this is all you're doing to support women in the workplace, you're failing. So how in other ways can this affect women of color, and also kind of reinforce some of the barriers that women of color face? And what can we do to get past this where we're stuck in the lean in movement?
It's a great question. And I do think that a lot of it is recognizing the privilege. It goes back to that and knowing what to do with it. Especially for white women that, end up in leadership positions that have opportunities to use their voice in meaningful ways. There's an opportunity to use that in a way that allows you to expand the circle, expand the things that you're looking for and the questions that you ask. And I think that there's also opportunities for things like reverse mentorship when you look at things from an intersectional lens, that as a woman of color, I have things to teach to a white woman in leadership that she could also teach me. And it's like taking away, like, it's not about taking away color necessarily, because I think that that plays such a significant part in building who you are as a person. That's a really big part of identity. But it is about looking at, okay, what is it that I experience that just comes naturally to me because of how I was raised, because of the color of my skin, because the fact that I can assimilate, but what is it that someone can also teach me from their experiences of the resilience and the courage that it takes to navigate a world that isn't designed for you? And I think there's opportunities there to look at that whole mentorship model and understand, like, how do you really look at it from a perspective of reciprocal learning and teaching one another around your own experiences? Because I think that's where connection gets built. That's where deep empathy is found. That's where you can find opportunities for collaboration and understand that there's so much that we can teach one another and so much we can learn from one another. I think that's a really, it's easier said than done for sure, like most of these things, but what it really boils down to is that human to human connection. And how do you really look at yourself from a place of privilege to understand what has been afforded to me that I need to seek to understand that hasn't been afforded in somebody else's life? And how do I get to the heart of that to be able to support them in a way that's really meaningful for them? So I look at myself and I think about all of the immigrant women in my life, and I recognize I have something in me, whatever it is. I didn't necessarily have role models in my household. I have a mother who immigrated here from Pakistan, who was highly educated but didn't utilize any of that because the language barriers and sort of all of the change that happened, leaving behind essentially her whole family and everything she knew. So I didn't have that direct role model in my life, but I found it somewhere in terms of the courage to start talking about these things. And I recognize that that's privilege in me, that I have been able to simulate enough to have a successful career, to be able to build something outside of the 9 to 5 as well. And I want to be able to seek to understand the experiences of an immigrant woman who is being told that in order to really find a job in Canada and to do well, you have to, you know, try to assimilate as much as possible and try to remove all the things that make you different. And I want to seek to understand that experience, because when I look at someone like her, I think about, oh my God, like, talk about courage. Like, that is so deep seated in who you are, because you picked up your life and you moved to another country and you learned a new language and you learned all about things that I have never put myself in the position to do. So I think there's a reverse mentorship piece that is so reciprocal, and there's an opportunity there to lean into that in a meaningful way around how do we access our privilege and use it to teach one another.
Well, it also shows you what we miss, right? Like the fact that she never had a chance to bring her knowledge to our greater community and contribute. We see that all the time, like just the lack of different voices and different ideas, and like we get stuck in our innovation because we all think the same.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I love the points you raised about resiliency, and I think part of that also ties back to what you said a bit earlier, which leads to my next question. Which so kind of you mentioned before about how, you know, people of color and women of color in particular, the workplaces aren't designed for them, and they experience these daily examples of experiences of microaggressions or racism or things like that, or being systemically excluded from things, and more often than not in companies, the burden of advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion work falls to people that are diverse within the company or viewed as diverse. We're all diverse, but to women of color or men of color or a woman, an indigenous woman, things like that. But and to me, that's a very almost colonial attitude where we're tasking, a woman of color to advance EDI work in an organization, typically off the side of her desk with no extra resources or budget or support. And now all of a sudden she's
in a system not designed for her.
Not designed for her when she has already experienced probably daily trauma, right? And throughout her life. And now she's set up to solve this huge, complex, systemic issue for the entire company. And that's not only just unfair, but it's a huge burden and pretty bad. But so I'd love to ask you about how can workplaces be better allies. So you mentioned so many great ideas on how individuals can be allies. And is there anything that like a workplace can do almost systemically to become an ally as well?
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a lot around even just the way that policies and processes are designed around that team member life cycle in a sense. So I go back to that traditional kind of HR perspective, because that's kind of what I know. And I think that has the most significant impact in everything that you do, because there's a leadership element to that. There's a recruitment element. There's a talent management element there. And I think that it's a matter of really auditing all of those experiences to understand, like, where are the barriers that we are setting up for people to immediately feel like they have to assimilate? Where's that one moment of truth for them where they had to suddenly decide, I can't be myself in this scenario. I have to pretend to be this person in order to navigate through this interview process in order to land this job. And from day one, I can't talk about the things that make me different, because that's just not the way it is in this culture. And it falls on leadership significantly to be able to challenge some of those norms, as well as HR. And even from a leadership perspective, it is as simple as really just seeking to understand that individual on a human to human level, to understand, like, what is it that motivates you? How do you like to be recognized? What can I do to really see you as a full person? Even when you're looking at the recruitment process, I know that a lot of organizations are going down the path of using video interviewing processes and all of these pieces that, put people at a disadvantage in some capacity because already people are awkward during a job interview. It's already uncomfortable. And then you add the layer of having to watch yourself on video and talk to a computer. And there's something that's lacking in terms of that human connection around, even if it's just the organization telling the candidate, here are some ways in which you can navigate through this in a way that allows you to be authentic, that allows you to feel like you can be yourself. Here's a video of me as the recruiter, the leader, speaking to you so that you know that you're not in this alone. Just having ways to humanize all of those pieces of the process. When you're looking at the talent management process, a lot of times what happens is you have a bunch of leaders sitting in a room with HR. And they're going through their list of people that are currently on their team, and they focus on those folks that are high performing and low performing. And it's a matter of looking at that and challenging, do we actually have a very diverse succession plan for some of these folks? Are we pulling from people that look, think, act exactly like them? Or are we actually challenging ourselves to say, hey, in order to actually get ourselves to a place of really being different and pushing the envelope, or actually trying to progress as an organization overall, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it will support our long-term efforts, we need to think about what success could look like when it's not in this traditional box around this subset of experience, this type of person. It starts in all of those places, but I do think that there's an opportunity as well from just an individual leadership perspective that if your organization and your culture and your HR team is not sort of supporting that desire to kind of be a little bit different, you as a leader have a lot of leeway to be able to say, this is how I do it with my team. I want to make this place really a sense of belonging for people. I want to make sure that they feel connected to me in a meaningful way, that they don't feel like there's this subordinate boss relationship where I hold all the power, that it is about setting that stage and that expectation from the moment that we connect and the moment that we start having a job interview to the day that you start your job or even weeks leading up to that, that you feel like I really see you. That in itself is so, so powerful. And it doesn't necessarily address the systemic issues at that individual level, but it makes such a significant difference for people to recognize that that person actually sees me and they care. And there's someone that I could really thrive under because they understand the depth of who I am. And even in the interview process, like when I was a recruiter, I spent a long time in my HR career in the talent acquisition spaces. And the question that I love to ask people, especially when I was hiring for my own teams, was tell me about like a character defining moment in your life that has made you who you are. Because to me, that allowed me to push past all of the things that were traditional on a resume, that allowed me to see, like maybe the person talks about the fact that they immigrated to Canada by themselves, or they decided at the age of 40 that they were going to go back to school and reinvent their career. Like those are the things that I want to get to the heart of and know more about. And that allows me to really see that person fully. I think it's about at the individual level, whatever you can do as a leader to really create that sense of belonging, and then doing a true audit on all of the systems, processes, ways in which you engage with your people to understand what are those barriers, where are those moments where people have to put their mask on in order to really fit in. That's a very long-term process to evolve and to fix, and it requires a significant amount of effort and buy-in to be able to move those things forward. But from a workplace perspective, that's where you really see thriving cultures and places where people really feel a sense of belonging.
I think that's really great because you emphasize how important HR can play a role in this. And Marcy and I will say that we've worked with companies where you'll have buy-in from the bottom, obviously, and buy-in from the top, and you get stuck in the middle. And in the geological terms, a lot of our geo groups will say they get stuck. It gets stuck in the clay layer in the middle, right? So it goes up and down and gets stuck. And it shows you how important those middle managers are in their leadership. And if you don't have the buy-in from the middle, the ones that are doing the day-to-day work, doing that leadership, you can see how the whole thing will fall apart and how there could be such a collaboration between, say, an HR department, EDI group, to support that group, because if that group can be, because they're the ones, let's face it, the middle managers are the ones that are not paid that great but have the good chunk of the work to do, right? So it really shows you that, one, to have diverse leadership there is important, and two, to give them the support they need so that they can be the middle and I don't know, let's wash away the clay, I guess, and help with the full transition of the company. So yeah, thank you for emphasizing that.
Absolutely.
Mm. Well, thank you so much. And we're running up to our time limit for today's podcast episode, but I just wanted to ask, is there anything else that you wanted to share or mention that we didn't cover?
Or maybe even talk about your own podcast and some of the cool things you've talked about in your last 2 seasons?
Sure. Yeah. I think with the Color Gap, we originally started it talking about the experiences of women of color in business. And then even in our second season, we started to delve into a lot of different topics that kind of covered the gamut of the experiences of women of color. And, we don't know the lived experience of every woman of color. We know it from our own perspectives around me being Pakistani, Muslim, first generation Canadian, and my co-host Susie being Korean Canadian, and just sort of navigating through the world in that lens. But what we started to do in our second season was start to look at different layers around things like beauty ideals and even things like the immigrant advantage around when we think about the future of work and what's going to be the most important around the skill sets that companies are really looking for. We want to start to change the narrative around how immigrants really see the things that make them unique as actual advantages for them around. We talked about resilience and courage and the things that they're sort of baked into their brains around, well, it's just what you have to do and it's not something to celebrate, to actually being like, actually, when you think about all of the things that are going to be required to navigate a new world that's very digital, that's very focused on AI, and the things that help you stand out are those critical thinking skills and the ability to kind of navigate change. That's such a thing that people need to, hang on to, right? And recognize that it's a real a form of brilliance that a lot of times they don't really give themselves a lot of credit and kudos around those things. And for our third season, we're very fired up by the things that are going on with the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. And we want to, of course, not cloud the space with our perspectives that are not lived experiences, but we do want to be able to dive in to invite those voices to the table and to start talking about things like allyship, talking about why race is so difficult to discuss and what makes it so uncomfortable for everybody, not just white people. There's also layers around anti-Blackness within ethnic communities that a lot of people don't talk about, but it's the truth, right? And it's like, and it is about understanding, how do you start to move the needle as a person of color around evolving what that looks like in your own life, instead of, pointing the finger at white people and saying that it's their problem. It's actually everybody's problem. And we all have a part to play in advancing the conversation. We're really excited about our third season. We're going to be delving into that probably in the next month or so. We took a bit of a break on our second season, just happened to finish right before the entire pandemic hit. So the timing was good for us to get a bit of a refresh, get a refocus on what we really wanted to do. But we're excited about what's coming up. We just want to start digging into a lot of different topics that are not just specifically connected to the world of business, and really look at all of the layers of experience that encompass being a woman of color. So
that's fantastic. That sounds great. Well, I look forward to the third season. And just to kind of wrap up today's episode, I was madly trying to keep track of some key takeaways to share. So feel free to chime in, both of you, if there's anything I missed. But some key takeaways could be that it's so important to amplify the voices of others and their lived experiences, and include that as central to any sort of EDI work that you do. And seek out other stories, seek out people's lived experiences that are different than yours. And more often than not, you find out that it's way more common than you think. Also, just building on the discussion around that the world and the workplaces aren't designed for us, whether that just be women in all their diversity, but also especially women of color. with the way the workplace's systems and structure and policies and power relations are. Also, it's important for HR. It's important for all of us to realize that HR may not be necessarily the best place to advance EDI. There's certainly a really great place to do it, but HR departments tend to also be not very diverse themselves, and it's hard for them to practice what they preach. And we should all encourage them to do so. So on that note, allyship is incredibly important. And individually, in order to become more active and greater allies, we could begin by recognizing and understanding what our gaps are. Also seek to understand different lived experiences, different than our own, and kind of audit how you're accessing your information, and how diverse are those sources and perspectives. And then once you build up that knowledge, then actively shift that dialogue and share other people's perspectives and challenge others to do the same. And with regards to employee resource groups or ERGs, they can be incredibly powerful, but it's so important to make sure that they're formed and have strong support from executives and the leadership. That'll help accelerate their success. And then also workplaces. Workplaces also have a role in being allies writ large. So not just within HR departments, but everyone can play a role in this, no matter what your position is in the organization. And but specifically, workplaces should be kind of auditing their own policies and systems and processes for gaps and barriers, identify them and find creative ways to mitigate them, and focus on how we can build cultures where people can be themselves. And I really love the perspective, Shahzia, that you bring to HR. As an HR professional, you bring a really refreshing perspective on the importance of advancing EDI, but from like a human perspective, and that's grounded in human-to-human connection and empathy, and celebrating diversity and finding ways to encourage people to really authentically be themselves. So thank you so much for that and for your work in this area.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will definitely put some information in our resource section about your podcast and maybe some references about what we spoke to today. And you can find Exclusion on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and Buzzsprout. And Shahzia, where can we find the Color Gap podcast?
I think all of the above as well. I believe we are on iTunes, Google Play, as well as Spotify, and Buzzsprout. And then we have a website, www.thecolorgap.com. And we always emphasize it's color spelled the Canadian way. Helps with the view. So we are actively looking at what we're doing also coming into the next year. And so we'll be going into season 3, like we said, in probably about another month or so.
Oh, awesome. Wonderful. Well, let's continue the conversation. Please let us know what you think. Reach out to any of us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and even the Exclusions YouTube channel. And we'd love to hear from you.
All right. Well, until next time. Bye.
Bye.